I've been asked to tell this story 142 times. I counted. Ambassadors, council delegates, journalists from 6 different species, some of them with ears where their mouths should be, some of them breathing something that smelled like ammonia and old metal. A Vrethian historian who spent 3 hours just calibrating his recording device while I sat there with cold coffee in my hand, watching him twitch at every sound the ship made. And every single one of them, every diplomat, every academic, every nervous little press officer who kept touching their credentials badge like it was some kind of talisman, every one of them started the same way. "So tell me," they'd say, "what was it like to be there?" And I'd look at them, and I'd take a breath, and I'd try to find the words for something that still doesn't fully fit into language. Not human language. Not the 7 other languages I can speak well enough to get by in. Not whatever the Vrethians call their system of communication, where they sort of hum at different pitches and your translator has to spend 3 seconds guessing what emotion they're in. Here's the truth, since everyone keeps asking for it. It wasn't dramatic the way people want it to be. It wasn't some explosion of pride, some cinematic moment where humanity stood up and the music swelled, and you felt the goosebumps march up your arms in a line. It was quieter than that. It was the kind of quiet that only happens when something very large moves very slowly through very empty space. We sent 1 ship. 1. The Galactic Defensive Council had broadcast on 47 frequencies, in 32 languages, across the entire breadth of the Western Reach, asking every contributing civilization to submit military forces for the relief of Vorath Station. The Vorath system was the gateway, the last chokepoint before the Keth Dominion could pour through into 6 inhabited sectors and start the cascade that everyone had been pretending wasn't coming for 11 years. Every species with a seat on the council was called. The Thraxi submitted an orbital platform with 42 fighters. The Usuli sent a battle group of 6 vessels. The Krell Compact, which is notoriously stingy about deploying assets, committed 2 destroyers and a logistics ship. 17 other species sent what they could, dozens of ships, hundreds of fighters, crews in the thousands. Earth submitted 1 ship. 1. The Council's initial response, which I have read many times and which still makes me feel a particular mixture of pride and exasperation, was approximately, "Is this an error in transmission? Please resubmit your military asset declaration with complete inventory." Earth's response came back in about 40 minutes, which, given the communication lag in that sector, means someone on our side punched the reply button almost instantly after receiving the question. No error, 1 vessel designation, UES Revenant. Classification redacted, ETA 16 cycles. Now, I need to tell you something about the Revenant before I tell you what happened. Because the ship itself is part of the story. You can't understand the ending if you don't understand the beginning, and the beginning is a ship that doesn't look the way you'd expect a warship to look. Part 2, the setup. I came aboard the Revenant 2 years before Vorath. I'd been working as a weapons liaison officer, which is a title that sounds more exciting than it usually is. Most of my job involved sitting in rooms with people from other species and explaining why our munition specifications were formatted differently from theirs, and no, we can't just convert them on the fly, please stop asking. And I'd been assigned to the Revenant because my commanding officer, Colonel Ashapark, thought I needed field experience. Field experience, she said, like we were going camping. My first sight of the Revenant was from a shuttle bay at the Reach station in orbit above Mars. I'd seen the ship on schematics. I'd read the specs, which were, and this is me putting it politely, aggressively classified. Most of what was in my actual briefing packet was either redacted or so technically dense that it read like someone had tried to encrypt the manual inside itself. But I'd seen the silhouette. Everyone who works in Earth defense has seen the silhouette. The Revenant is not a beautiful ship. I want to be clear about that. Some ships are beautiful. The HFY military vessels, for example, look like someone took the concept of speed and made it solid, all sleek arching curves and material so reflective that they look wet in the light. The Krell destroyers have this angular geometric quality that's almost architectural. You look at them and think, that was designed. The Revenant looks like it was grown. It's roughly cylindrical if a cylinder had opinions about itself and had been arguing with engineers for 40 years. The main hull is approximately 2.3 kilometers long, which puts it squarely in the dreadnought class by most galactic measurement standards. But it's not built the way a dreadnought is supposed to be built. There's no clean line from bow to stern. The ship is layered, modular sections, interlocking armor plates that can reconfigure. And here's where the specs started getting actually interesting, in real time. The Revenant can change shape during combat. Not dramatically, not like some kind of cartoon transformation, but the external geometry can shift, sections can retract, redirect, expose, or protect specific systems. The armor plating moves. It breathes. When I saw it for the first time from the shuttle bay, sitting there in the dark with Earth behind it and the sun reduced to a bright distant point, my first thought was that it looked ancient. It had that quality, that weight, like something geological. My second thought was, that thing looks angry. I know that's not a rational thought to have about a ship, but I had it anyway, and 2 years of working with the crew confirmed it wasn't entirely wrong. The Revenant had a crew complement of 4,162 people. 4,162 people on a ship that classified dreadnought. The HFY battle group the Council had called up 6 vessels, collectively, had approximately 12,000 personnel. The Thraxi orbital platform had roughly 600. For comparison, the average Krell destroyer, 2 of which the Compact had contributed, ran a crew of approximately 900 per ship. The Revenant's crew density was extraordinary, not because we were short-staffed, because every single station on that ship required expertise that had been, on other vessels of similar class, automated. The Revenant didn't automate things that humans could do. That was a design principle that had gotten Earth Defense Command into exactly the kind of arguments with the Galactic Standardization Council that I spent most of my pre-Revenant career being a footnote to. Earth's position, stated plainly, was, we trust humans to make decisions at the rate decisions need to be made, and we build our ships accordingly. The Galactic Council's position was, that's inefficient. Earth's response, delivered by Admiral Ewan Kao at the 2287 Defense Summit, was 7 words. We know that's exactly the point. I met Captain Soria Osman on my first day aboard. She wasn't hard to find. The captain's reputation preceded her the way a weather system precedes a storm. You hear things. You notice the way people talk about her. You adjust your expectations and still somehow get it wrong. Soria Osman was 46 years old at Vorath. She'd been commanding ships since she was 31. She'd done 2 combat tours in the pre-Council era, before humanity had joined the broader galactic community, back when Earth defense was mostly dealing with the fracturing of the Belt colonies and the brief, chaotic 3-year period we called the Outer System Crisis. She was tall, not dramatically tall, but the kind of tall that organizes itself in a room. She stood in a way that made the available space feel intentional. She had close-cropped gray-black hair and dark brown skin, and a habit of looking at you slightly longer than conversation required, like she was doing a calculation the whole time you were talking and hadn't finished it yet. She shook my hand when we met. I know that sounds like nothing. But on a Galactic Council posting, handshakes were a thing you did with other humans when you were feeling sentimental about the species. The official gesture for most Council contexts was a kind of mutual bow, hands open. Humans did it automatically by then. Had been for years. Soria Osman shook my hand, looked at me with that calculation in her eyes and said, "Voss, I read your file, you speak Krell." "Conversationally," I said. "What does that mean?" "It means I'm better at it than anyone thinks I should be, and worse at it than I tell people." She almost smiled. "Almost. Good," she said. "We're going to need that. Come and see the ship." What she showed me over the next 6 hours was not what I'd expected. I'd expected a warship, and it was unmistakably. The weapons systems alone took an hour to walk through, and we didn't even go below Deck 12, which was where the classified payload was stored, and which I didn't have clearance for yet. The Revenant carried conventional rail slug batteries, plasma dispersal arrays, a point defense network that operated at reaction speeds I can still barely think about without getting a headache, and classified, and I'll keep it that way, something else. Something that the ship's crews called the answer, in the kind of low, careful voice you use for things you don't want to jinx. But the ship was also a community. That was the part I hadn't expected. There was a kitchen, not a mess hall, a kitchen, where 2 of the crew, Lieutenant Petrosolis and Petty Officer Quaim Osai, ran a completely unauthorized but universally acknowledged rotating menu that used a combination of hydroponic produce from the agricultural deck, and whatever Solis could convince the supply coordinator to acquire during port stops. There was a small library on Deck 9, actual physical books, a few hundred of them, which someone had been adding to over what looked like decades of continuous occupation. There was a section of Deck 6 that the crew called the yard, which was a curved stretch of corridor about 40 meters long that had been repurposed into something between a social space and an improvised sports arena, where people played a complicated hybrid game involving a rubber ball and rules that seemed to evolve weekly. There were arguments, real ones. I watched a heated 15-minute dispute between the chief engineer, a compact, extraordinarily intense woman named Sergeant Major Yuki Tanaka, and a senior weapons technician named Corporal Freddy Ez, about whether a particular power routing modification was brilliant or dangerous. And the argument went through 2 conference rooms and eventually resolved itself in the mess hall when Tanaka grudgingly admitted the modification had a statistically smaller failure window than she'd calculated, and Ez bought her a coffee as a kind of peace offering. There was music, actual music, playing from actual instruments in at least 3 different sections of the ship on any given day. One of the navigation team, Ensign Rosalind Mwangi, played something stringed that sounded like a cross between a violin and a guitar, and filled whatever corridor she was practicing in with something that made you slow down without meaning to. 4,162 people living in a ship. Not stationed, not deployed, living. And every single one of them knew the ship the way you know a house you've lived in for years, not from blueprints, not from schematics, but from the sounds of it in the dark, the way the air tasted on different decks, the particular rhythm of the engine pulse that meant routine versus the slightly different rhythm that meant something was being assessed. They knew the ship and the ship, in some way that I am not entirely sure is metaphorical, knew them. Part 3, Building Tension. We received the Council's call at 3:40 hours, ship time. I was in my quarters, not sleeping. I had about a 40% success rate with sleep on a good week, which my official medical record describes neutrally, and which I describe as my body's ongoing refusal to follow reasonable schedules. I was reading something, I don't even remember what, when the priority tone went through the ship's communication system. Not a klaxon. The Revenant didn't use klaxons for anything that wasn't immediate hull breach territory. The priority tone was a lower, steadier sound, 3 notes, ascending, that your brain registered as important without triggering the panic response a klaxon does. I'd read somewhere that the tone had been designed by a neurologist. I believed it. I was on the bridge in 7 minutes. Captain Osman was already there. She was always already there. I think she may have slept on the bridge in a way that was carefully not documented in any official record. She had the council transmission on the main screen, and she was reading it with an expression that wasn't quite neutral. There was something in her jaw, something in the way she was holding her hands behind her back, that told me she'd already made a decision. "Vorith," she said when I stepped up beside her. I read what was on the screen. The third incursion. The Keth Dominion forces massing beyond the Vorith system. The Council's activation of the Mutual Defense Protocol. The call going out to every contributing member species. "What are we committing?" I asked. She looked at me, that calculation again. "Us," she said. I stared at her for a second. "Just us." "Just us." "Captain, the Council is asking for." "I know what the Council is asking for." Her voice didn't change volume or tone, it just got more precise. "And I know what we can do. The question is whether High Command agrees with my assessment." She turned back to the screen. "They already have. The authorization came in 12 minutes ago." I looked at the crew around me. Lieutenant Commander Benedict Hale at navigation, already pulling up charts. Lieutenant Petra Solis at weapons. She'd apparently gone straight from kitchen duty to the bridge without stopping, and was wearing an apron over her uniform, which she didn't appear to have noticed. Sergeant Major Tanaka was at engineering, speaking quietly into a headset, and from the rate she was talking I could tell she was already spinning up systems she normally kept at standby. Ensign Mwangi wasn't playing her instrument tonight. She was at her station with both hands on the console, and her focus had that quality, that narrowing, that I'd only seen in people who were very good at what they did and knew they were about to need to be. "When do we leave?" I asked. 40 minutes, Captain Osmond said. "Get the liaisons briefed. I want every department with updated combat protocols by the time we clear the outer system." "What do I tell them about our force composition?" She looked at me one more time. "Tell them the truth," she said. "We're coming, that should be enough." The Council's reaction to Earth submission came through 6 hours after we left dock. I'll give you the diplomatic version first. The Council expressed concern that Earth's contribution appeared to represent a significant underallocation of military assets relative to the established threat profile, and requested clarification of humanity's strategic assessment. Now I'll give you the actual version. The Thraxi representative, whose name I will transliterate as Veshkaran, because the actual pronunciation involves a resonant frequency that human vocal cords can't reliably produce, transmitted directly to Earth's Council liaison and said, and I am reading from the translated transcript here. "One ship. You have sent one ship. The Keth Dominion has deployed a fleet. We have counted 47 vessels in the Vanguard alone. Please explain to us, in terms that we can present to our government, why Earth believes one ship is an adequate response to 47. Earth's liaison, a woman named Deputy Director Priya Subramaniam, who I have tremendous respect for, and who I also believe would be equally comfortable negotiating a trade deal or dismantling a bomb, sent back a response that I have memorized and which I will reproduce here. "The Revenant is adequate. Thank you for your concern." Veshkaran's reply was one word. It translated roughly as incomprehensible. What the Council didn't know, what almost nobody outside of certain specific clearances knew, was what the Revenant had been built to do. Not in the weapons sense, not in the tactical specifications and engagement protocol sense. In the deeper sense, the Revenant had been built to be the last argument. Earth Defense Command, in the long history of its existence, had developed a philosophy of military deployment that was different from the galactic standard in one very fundamental way. Most species, the Thraxi, the Usuli, the Krell, almost everyone with a seat at the Council table, designed their military forces on the attrition model. You build enough ships to sustain losses. You build enough ships to project force across multiple fronts. You build enough ships that even if the enemy destroys 30% of your fleet, you still have 70% left. Earth built differently. Earth built for the single, decisive, defining engagement, the one that doesn't need a follow-up. The one where what you bring to the table is so precisely, catastrophically correct for the specific situation that the question of attrition never becomes relevant, because the engagement doesn't last long enough for attrition to operate. It's not the philosophy of a species that had an easy time of things. Humans had spent a very long time fighting each other, in very confined spaces, with very limited resources, before we had the luxury of thinking about strategy in terms of sustainable fleet ratios. The wars we fought in the centuries before we reached for space were wars where the question wasn't how many ships can we afford to lose. It was how do we make sure this ends. The Revenant was the physical expression of that philosophy. One ship, absolute capability, complete commitment, and a crew that had been training for exactly this kind of engagement for 2 years. I should tell you about the crew in more detail, because the crew is the heart of this. There were, among the 4,162 people aboard the Revenant, something like 47 nationalities if you're counting by the geographic divisions that still, for historical and bureaucratic reasons, showed up on service records. There were people who had grown up in the Antarctic settlements and people who had grown up in the Lagos megacomplex. There were people whose families had been in space since the first generation of permanent habitation, and people who had signed up from small agricultural communities that still used rain cycles as a calendar. There were Wren's siblings, 3 of them, assigned to different departments, which I'd been told was technically against regulations, and which everyone on the ship appeared to be cheerfully pretending not to know. Ensign Noah Wren in navigation, Corporal Timon Wren in hull maintenance, and Petty Officer Sasha Wren in medical. The 3 of them had a kind of wordless coordination during drills that bordered on eerie, and which Sergeant Major Tanaka said, with the particular flatness of someone stating a fact they find irritating and admirable in equal measure, was the most efficient sibling arrangement she'd ever worked around. There was Chief Medical Officer Dr. Adiz Chukwu, who had the patience of a geologist and a bedside manner that combined genuine warmth with the kind of brisk practicality that makes medical emergencies go from panic to managed in about 30 seconds. She had a rule, one of many, that she communicated to new crew members on their first day. Everyone tells me what's wrong with them. I cannot help people who are performing wellness. She said it pleasantly, but she meant every syllable of it. There was Lieutenant Emiliano Reyes in weapons coordination, who was 29 years old and had the distinction of having scored higher on the tactical simulation battery than anyone in Earth defense history, which had earned him both the Revenant posting and a level of informal scrutiny that would have crushed someone less psychologically grounded. Reyes responded to scrutiny by becoming quieter, more careful, and more accurate. He played cards in the evenings with anyone willing, and he lost often and graciously, and the one time I asked him if he ever felt the pressure of his reputation, he thought about it for a long time and said, "The simulations aren't real. This is real. The pressure is just information." There was Petty Officer First Class Tomás Ibarra in communications, who was responsible, in a very direct, practical way, for the thing that happened at Vorath that no one has quite been able to explain to the Council's satisfaction. Ibarra had an unusual specialty. He had spent 3 years before his Revenant posting learning, on his own time and with his own resources, to communicate in Keth. Not Keth trade language, not the simplified diplomatic register. Actual, operational Keth, the language the Keth Dominion used internally, the one their commanders used on encrypted tactical channels. Nobody had asked him to. Nobody had thought to ask him to. He'd done it because he was the kind of person who thought, well, someone should probably know this, and then quietly became that person. I will come back to Ibarra. We traveled 16 cycles to reach Vorath. 16 cycles is approximately 22 Earth days. It's a long time to be in transit with a crew that knows what's waiting at the other end. The ship didn't quiet down. That was the thing that surprised me, coming from smaller postings where a tense transit meant tense silence. The Revenant during those 16 cycles was, if anything, more alive than it had been at dock. People talked more. The game in the yard got louder, more contested, the rules shifting faster than usual. Quaim Osai's kitchen produced meals that were, by objective consensus, significantly better than his average. He'd broken into a reserve of real coffee he'd been hoarding for approximately 8 months, and the smell of it on decks 4 through 6 became, for those 16 cycles, a kind of scent memory that I still associate with the feeling of knowing something large is coming and choosing to be present anyway. Rosalind Mwangi played every evening, different pieces, some of them recognizable, some of them that drifting, searching quality that told you she was working something out in real time. People would stop in the corridor outside whatever space she'd claimed and just stand there for a moment, not applauding or acknowledging it, just absorbing it before moving on. Captain Osman ran drills every 48 hours. Full combat simulation, every system, every department. Not to check whether things worked, she knew they worked. She ran them, I came to understand, to keep the rhythm of the ship consistent. To make sure that the response patterns, the muscle memory of 4,000 people operating as an integrated system, didn't develop any lag from the transit. On the 14th cycle, she called me to her office. It was a practical space. No decoration that wasn't functional. A desk with 3 screens. A narrow window that, at our current position, showed nothing but the particular deep blackness of transit space with its odd distant starfield. A small shelf with 6 books on it, paper, clearly old. "I want you to draft a communication to the Council fleet," she said, before I'd fully sat down. "Coordinating approach vectors?" I asked. "No," she looked at the window. "I want you to tell them to hold position when we arrive." I processed that. "You want the Council fleet to hold position?" "That's correct. Captain, the Keth Vanguard has 47. "I know what the Keth Vanguard has." She turned from the window. "Do you know what happens when a multi-species coalition fleet engages the Keth Dominion in open space?" I thought about the 3rd incursion briefings, the 2nd before it, the scattered, terrible, expensive engagements that had characterized every meaningful Keth engagement in the last 30 years. "Coordination problems," I said. "Coordination problems," she agreed. "Different tactical languages, different engagement protocols, different risk thresholds. The Thraxi have a doctrine that prioritizes capital ship survivability. They will not commit their orbital platform to close engagement under almost any circumstances. The Usulai doctrine is aggressive at range and cautious up close, which is almost exactly inverse to Krell doctrine. You put those 3 in a combined engagement, and you get friendly fire incidents. You get gaps in coverage. You get the Keth reading the seams between doctrines and exploiting them. And if we go in alone?" She looked at me with that calculation. "No seams," she said.